thanks everyone for coming out to listen to this, and I want to thank Simone as well because she makes a perfect lead-in topic. Our study looked at a lot of these factors she was talking about. Now we were much more interested in looking at how students go through their learning programs in blended learning situations. I did this study with Laurence Gagnère, and we presented together when we were at the conference. We've been working on this, comparing 3 different programs, and I'll tell you a little bit more about those in a minute. For myself, I work at the University of Geneva and at the Distance University of Switzerland, and I have been giving courses on instructional design for distance learning for over 10 years now, and I've been in the field of multimedia design and e-learning for probably since 1999. So I've seen a lot of things evolve, and I've seen things take cyclical patterns and come back. We used to talk about open learning repositories and click and learn and online learning and e-learning, and now we're talking about MOOCs. Essentially, we're talking about the same thing often. And then there's always been this undercurrent of blended learning and technology-enhanced learning, which seems to be almost a parallel universe to this online autodidactic approach to online learning. And so to get back to our study over here, I'd like to ask you out there, there's 2 questions that I've posted, and the first one is really to think about you're in various institutions. Some of you are in face-to-face or traditional brick-and-mortar institutions. Some of you are in distance universities. I'd like to think of, I guess, mostly take a look at, for those of you who are in brick-and-mortar institutions, what proportion of your students do you consider to be non-traditional students? Just without any particular definitions being given to this, what proportion do you consider to be non-traditional?
I see people are answering the questions right now. 5 out of 26 participants, so I'll just wait a bit longer. So I see 7 people answered the questionnaire so far.
Okay. I'm assuming that a lot of you are from distance universities as well. So
I'll just publish the results.
See this?
Here you go.
Okay, so we're looking at. Okay, there's one person over here at least who says that thinks the majority of their students are actually non-traditional students, and this being in a brick-and-mortar institution. Let's move on to the next question, just so we can have a comparison a little bit. What proportion of your blended learning or distance learning students do you consider to be non-traditional? Yes, I see the question here. What do we mean by non-traditional? Well, this is our next slide. So just to see what I'm just trying to see what your representations are for now, if you consider your students to be traditional students or non-traditional students, regardless really of whether they are engaged in distance learning or in okay, we're looking at, again, we think of these non-traditional students being a minority of students. If we can move on to the next slide. Now, there we go. Move on to the next slide. Well, looking at the literature, and some of the people have looked at, done some meta-analyses of things that people refer to when they speak of non-traditional students, what the research refers to when they talk about non-traditional students. We see things generally we see students that are over 25 that are geographically distant, living off campus. so on, or employed or constrained by other obligations or activities, whether they be family obligations, sometimes they could be involved in sports activities or other. And then we get into gender, ethnicity, sociocultural background, socioeconomic status, whether or not people have disabilities, if they're enrolled in alternative programs, part-time or distance blended learning, admission pathways, whether they came in through continuing education or other qualifications or equivalence programs to be able to come into university, whether or not they have a previous degree. These are all characteristics of people, of populations that have been qualified as non-traditional students. And even one study that I looked at was talking about now that in US community colleges, if they took these descriptors to identify non-traditional students, they'd be looking at roughly 75 to 80% of the population being in some way non-traditional. We're living in a time where people come back to studies, they come back and we're talking about lifelong learning. So we're seeing even in traditional institutions and face-to-face learning, we're seeing more non-traditional students coming in. And blended learning, for all of these factors that we see over here, actually seems to attract more non-traditional students. For instance, I can tell you a recent survey that we did at our distance university here in Switzerland, over 80% of the people were in one way or another actually non-traditional students just on the first 3 points. So this is to say that I guess in some way everyone is non-traditional. Well, we want to go that far, but we're looking at the traditional student as someone who has just finished their high school, leaving a diploma or whatever the equivalent, and is starting a bachelor degree. We're really looking at a large portion of the population in blended learning that is not coming directly from their high school and into a bachelor program. So we took a look at 3 different programs that are blended learning programs. And we wanted to see what their paths were. And we looked at just the population that did not complete their degree, actually. Normally what we would consider as dropouts, with the idea that actually maybe not all of them are really qualify as dropouts. But we wanted to see what their paths were through our 3 different programs. We're looking for, are there critical moments for their departures? What is the degree of completion before they withdraw? And to try to identify if there was a way to identify problematic courses. And this is to say we're only looking at administrative data, right? This is looking at the administrative data that is available to us without having to go and actually do surveys. This wasn't in preparation for further study, but that won't be addressed here. So we were looking at differences and similarities between these 3 programs. One was a master's program. One is a bachelor program, and another one is Certificate of Advanced Studies. So the master program, we're looking at 118 students over a period of 5 years. And this is a master's program in learning teaching technologies. It's a blended learning program. Students come in for 1 week of intense courses. So there'll be various courses being offered during that week. And then they work at a distance 5 to 6 weeks. And it's largely a project-based learning that is applied in many of the courses, but not exclusively. And then we're looking at a Bachelor of Psychology, and we looked only at the Bachelor of Psychology at a distance university, and we looked at 259 students over 5 years. And here and this is a much more traditional students in this traditional program, let's say. It's a Bachelor of Psychology. They come in, they are studying essentially at a distance. There are 5 periods a semester. They come in 1 day every 4 weeks. They have courses, face-to-face courses, and the rest of it is done at a distance. And then we looked at a Certificate of Advanced Studies. So this is continuing education students who are employed or otherwise, and they come in, and it's a 12 credit program. They come in 1 day, and then they have an equivalent of 2 days work at a distance to be completed over a 3 to 4 week period. Just to give you a sense of the distribution of this. And in here in this area, we look at the distribution of the students that actually graduated in each of the programs, students that are still enrolled, that they haven't finished their degrees yet during that 5-year period, the students that actually dropped out, and the students that were eliminated for administrative reasons. I'll give a distribution. So we, of course, now we're comparing 3 different programs. The master's program runs over, it can go from anywhere from, it can run from 4 semesters, and then if people actually ask for derogations, they can run up to 8 semesters long. The bachelor program should be accomplished within 9 semesters, and the certificate of advanced studies can be accomplished in 2 to 3 semesters maximum. But as we see here, of course, people tend to prolong things, or in the case of the bachelor program, as we're looking at only as people who dropped out, meaning that they were exmatriculated at some point, we see that some people actually never even, in the bachelor program, they don't even make it to the 9th semester. So we've seen in these programs, we were able to compare that in the master's and the bachelor program, they had most of the dropouts were early. We had early departures, whereas in the certificate of advanced studies, there were later departures coming at the 3rd semester. So then we tried to identify what is happening in these programs. So really our perspective is to look at programs. Students eliminated meant people who actually failed a certain number of exams and were no longer able to complete the program. So students who failed too many of their courses, for instance, would be eliminated. Sometimes they're I think also for the distance university students can also be eliminated for non-payment, so they're enrolled. And so as coming back to this particular slide over here, we were able to see that in the certificate program, for instance, people would actually be leaving the program at a much later date, actually once after all the courses have been completed and once the final work starts. And we also took a look at how many credits were they actually earning before withdrawing. And this was particularly interesting, that there wasn't any trend in the programs, but we were able to see that, for instance, that in the master's program, people were actually completing all of the credits except the work study and the master's thesis. I mean, more than half of the students were completing the majority of their credits and leaving dropping out once they had to do the master's thesis or work study. In the bachelor program, on the other hand, people were really leaving immediately at the beginning, almost as if this is not what was expected. This is not what they expected. And in the certificate of advanced studies, we had 2 periods. One period, we had some early departures that were happening in the first 2 or 3 courses. And then the rest of them were really distributed after this crucial 3rd semester, where they have to produce a report and actually implement their project. It's a professional project that they have to create a prototype and analyze it and write a report upon it, evaluate it and write a report upon it. So they're leaving at this point. And although there were no particular trends, we also looked at which courses. We tried to identify if there were critical courses that were causing this dropout. That were causing massive departures at certain points, and this is where we also realized that we had this phenomenon of missing students, meaning they didn't unenroll from the programs, they didn't fail from the programs, but they weren't enrolling in further courses, and we were trying to figure out what was going on here. And we see very clearly that in the bachelor program at the distance university, we were seeing that students were disappearing early on. Almost they enrolled, they may have shown up for 1 or 2 of the face-to-face sessions, and then they did not submit work. They just disappeared quietly in the early semesters. In the master's program, on the other hand, we have some early disappearances, but then at the end, we see that people who make it to the end will actually continue, and then again they're dropping off when they have to do their thesis towards the end. And the certificate, we have a similar sort of pattern, whereas here in the certificate program, we actually let them drag on. We've had students who come back 3 or 4 years later wanting to do their final project and get their certificate, and we sort of make exceptions for this. So we'd have a huge number of students that are kind of disappear, go off the radar after having completed all the course requirements, and it's time to do their final report, which is a 2-credit course. So some of these, one of the things, the conclusions that we drew actually is that we weren't really seeing any early departures due to disciplinary effect, where people were, with Hornick and all saw that students in fundamental sciences would drop out. Students with fundamental science backgrounds were more likely to drop out of humanities associated programs than and in social sciences there were higher dropout rates. We weren't really seeing anything because our master's program is probably a little bit more technical and more aligned to fundamental sciences. We weren't really seeing this, but again, I think we also saw a need to identify our non-traditional students' profiles, where they were coming from before entering the programs, see their backgrounds before entering the various programs. We also saw that no similar trends in the number of credits completed before withdrawal between the three programs, but we also questioned here at this point. We saw that in the bachelor program, for instance, the Bachelor of Psychology program, people were not being engaged in distance learning was not something that is part of the culture of being a psychologist or training or studying psychology. Whereas in the other two programs, both of the programs actually, one of them is in learning and teaching technologies, a master's in learning and teaching technologies, and the other one is a certificate in creating online courses. So actually learning at a distance is seen more as an advantage than an inconvenience, because they are actually using tools that they will be using in the future and what they are being trained to do. So this can have an added advantage. This blended learning is seen as an advantage rather than an inconvenience. And we see in the bachelor course, learning online, with this e-learning culture and these digital skills can be a barrier to success. And this sort of seemed to confirm Klein Null's findings about this, whether blended learning, whether in the discipline that people are studying, whether distance learning is seen as an advantage or an inconvenience, whether the skills that they're acquiring through this are seen as an advantage or an inconvenience or necessary. So this is a part of the ongoing work that we've been doing over here, is trying to identify here at the University of Geneva and working with the Continuing Education Department, trying to identify what are the e-learning skills that are necessary in order to participate in distance learning for students to be able to learn at a distance, because it does require certain skills and a certain culture. And I was wondering which of the following do your institutions offer to help e-learning, the development of e-learning culture and skills to participate in online communities, learning communities, and to benefit from this. Sorry, I have the give you a moment. Okay, there we go. Training tutorials online, voluntary courses, digital skills developed intentionally through course activities. Okay. And so, I mean, I was particularly thinking of Simone's presentation earlier with her with the field in which with theology, Catholic theology is not a field that is often associated with with online and with digital skills. So you can see that perhaps there's an example where digital skills might be a particular barrier to participating, or seen as not pertinent to what they are trying to learn. So it's just an added weight to their learning process, and trying to find ways to actually perhaps validate and to help students realize that they are acquiring an additional skill set by participating in blended learning is something that we're looking at here at our institution here now, whether it be through certification, through badges, through added credit, but somehow to just making students aware of the fact that they are learning additional skills that may be valued afterwards in the workforce. It's just Yandy. Oh, yes. Okay. Okay, I see that we're looking at. So, I want to know more about people who are doing C&D digital skills or developing digital skills, and see what kind of digital skills certification. Perhaps we can leave this for the discussion afterwards, but I really would like to hear more about this. And when we're looking at critical courses, well, it was quite easy to identify that big, heavy projects at the end seem to be, I don't know if it was a stumbling block, but I think what is happening in our master's program and our certificate program, even though our master's is an academic master's, preparing for research and preparing students to go on to a doctorate degree. It's not a professional, it's not a master's of advanced studies, whereas our certificate is advanced studies, it's continuing education. We're looking at that I think what we're seeing, and we also knowing the population a little bit closely, is that we have non-traditional students who are coming in for certain skill development, and this is not necessarily related to getting a certificate, to having certain certification, especially when we're talking about fields like in instructional design or preparing to use educational technology, where there aren't really certifications attached to that. Really, what you are judged on is your skills. And also, we have people who are already working in both of these programs, and also at the distance university. We know from certain studies at the distance university, for instance, recently we did a survey, and over 80% of the students were working 80% or more. So this is these are students who are working almost full time and are engaged in something that is probably the equivalent of 60% in terms of the hours. If their bachelor program goes over, they can follow the bachelor program in 4 years, in 4 to 5 years, as opposed to 3 to 4 years. This is not a huge extension. So where is that time going to come from? And how do you make students aware of the amount of time they will have to dedicate to their studies without scaring them off? I guess. And in our certificate program, students come in with a particular project that they wish to develop, at the end of which they develop during their studies. Often what we hear back from them is that once they've implemented their project, they've developed it, for them, writing the report and analyzing it and doing this, what they see as an academic exercise, is not necessarily important to them, unless they are someone who is seeking to have a higher qualification, to be recognized for something, seeking to go to climb. So if we have students who already have doctorate degree coming in to do their certificate because they want to learn how to put a particular project online, they want to create a particular online course, or they're following our master's program because they want to create online learning, for them the degree is not important in the end. It was the skill set that was important. So this raises the question of, do we consider this as a failure as an institution? Should we be equating every dropout or non-diploma, or when we don't actually deliver a diploma, should this be considered as a failure? And then how do we qualify success for these non-traditional students who are coming to develop certain skills and not necessarily there to have a degree, especially when we know that our governing bodies really measure the number of degrees delivered, the number of diplomas delivered, not the number of courses completed. I don't know what the situation is in your varying countries, but for instance, in Switzerland, continuing education is very expensive. If I compare the prices of our small 12 credit certificate program, which is continuing education, 6,005 would be the equivalent of about 5,800 euros. And if we look at our master's program, which is an academic master's program, there's an enrollment tax of 500. About 500 euros a semester. So we're looking at 120 credit program for 500 euros per semester versus a 12 credit program for almost 6,000 euros. You enroll in the program that costs a little bit less. That will give you the same skill set. Similarly, our bachelor program at the distance university, The tuition fees are about 1,200 euros per semester. By Swiss standards, that is nowhere near exorbitant. To pay 1,200 per semester to have access to 180 credits worth of courses is not a huge price to pay. So we're looking at non-traditional students, and we also looked at our students who are coming in who already have previous degrees. So somehow distance, I don't know if it's a distance learning being mixed with MOOCs, and maybe students' expectations coming in are to be able to freely roam, find the things that are useful to them and then go away, or if they're actually looking for certification, or maybe if the degree comes along, okay, it's a bonus. These are all questions that we're starting to ask and things that we really need to look into. Okay, sorry, I'm just looking at the comments a little bit. Okay. For Michael Cronin, who was looking at working with Moodle, have you ever considered using how Moodle has now added a layer of competences that could be used across a course, developing a certain competence? Have you looked at perhaps trying to define certain competences that are related to different activities that are put in Moodle? And, you know, for instance, if you have a forum discussion that it can give, that this can, if someone participates in the forum discussion, that this gives them an achievement in communicating in online communities, for instance. Okay. Okay. The questions that I wanted to open to discussion, sort of what, because we do see these non-traditional students who might not be coming in to get diplomas, who might be wanting to work part-time. One of the questions that I've actually heard is, should they be accommodated? If they're not here to, if they're not in, do they belong in higher education if they're not willing to commit to completing a degree? I mean, that I'm not saying that I have this point of view, but these are points of views that have been raised, especially when in discussions between the governing bodies who are interested in delivering degrees, and the impetus. So, dropout students complain of isolation, lack of interaction in the programs. Actually, we've looked at this in certain programs with our course evaluations that we've done in different areas. We have sort of two camps. We have those who say, stop bothering us, just give me the exam at the end. I don't have time to interact with other people. And then we have those who felt needed this interaction to be more motivated. We also have one of the recent surveys that we sent out at the distance university, we look at students are mostly looking for interaction with instructors. This is if they have, we asked them to put in order what types of interactions they're looking for, and interactions with the instructors is at the top if they're going to have interactions. It means that we have a public that is coming in. We also have people, we also had over 60% already had a bachelor, master, or doctorate degree coming into this psychology program. So we're looking at people who are looking for expertise in some way. They're looking for a certain expertise and direct contact with this expertise, and not necessarily at interacting for social reasons with other students was at the bottom of the list. So we're looking at populations who are already established, they're working, they have their social network. This is not what they're looking to build. They're looking to build a professional network, and they're looking to connect directly with instructors and with the expertise. So I don't think it's so, the isolation, social isolation was not that much of an issue. And in fact, when they find collaborative work or continuous evaluation sometimes to be limiting. But here there was an interesting study at Open University where there was, that I'd read about, where they actually tried to decrease dropout. And one of the measures that they took was to put in continuous evaluation throughout their courses instead of a final exam at the end. And yes, it decreased dropout significantly, but it also increased student dissatisfaction. So it was a sense, it was more of a case of broccoli is what I need, but I don't like broccoli. No, we don't. I know distance universities is working on something like this, trying to find what the indicators are. But it's very difficult to, I think, when some of the struggles we're coming up against is that at what level should you look at this? Looking at a student's activity level within one course, is that necessary? This can be because, without looking at the program as a whole, this could be because perhaps they're focused on another course in the program at the moment. I think it's very difficult to try to see. It's a very complex task to look at, to try to find what would be the indicators. I know the literature shows already what are some indicators, what are some predictors. That we looked at earlier. There's wide literature on what are some of the predictors, so perhaps I think preventive measures can be put in beforehand. And the other problem is what happens when you identify that someone is at risk of dropout. Are you going to call them and tell them, hey, where are you? What are you doing? If they find someone's finding the workload too heavy, what do we do? These are, what I'm trying to get at is that there's not a real easy solution to this, because we do also have an obligation, if we're delivering diplomas and degrees, that it has to, each credit has to represent 25 to 30 hours of work on the student's part. If people who are working full time are expecting to complete 30 credits a year, that's a lot of hours they have to find. So it's very complex. Other questions, another question that I sort of wonder is, maybe should higher education offer different degree options, meaning that not only this bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees, should they offer other degree options at comparable prices, let's say? So we're not going into the private sector for continuing education, which is really academic level education. I know that the participants, for instance, that come to our certificate program, one of the reasons why they don't go to the private sector is because they're not looking for just technical instruction on how to use Captivate. The prices for continuing education are exorbitant. Does the labor market ask for different degree options? Yeah, this is an interesting. I think this depends on the fields. This depends on which area you're in. I know, being someone who's involved in educational technologies, there aren't any real degrees that certify you as an educational technologist. Are you looking at short learning programs? Okay. Oh, yay. I want to look at that. This was one of our findings somewhere along the way, that when our certificate program actually has has 1 day with 2 days at a distance. So that represents 1 credit, and we have the 12 credits. So they can actually earn these. Some of them are prerequisites to others, but they can actually earn these independently. And whereas the bachelor degree at the distance learning university, the first semester they have 2 courses that are 10 credits each. So if you sort of miss out a little bit in the beginning, have a hard time starting off, you already failed half of your semester. It's not very encouraging to continue on to the next semester, to continue on to the next course. You failed, that's it. You have 2 courses, and you either get the 10 credits, or you either get the 20 credits, or you get 10 credits, or you get no credits. So we consider this being very discouraging for students coming in, whereas smaller, shorter courses may actually be a bit more encouraging and feel like you're advancing, help students feel like they're advancing in their programs, especially when the program has to drag out for 3 or 4 years. I'd like to hear from participants if they offer any various types of program and types of other degree options or other ways that they might have tried to, if they've seen similar problems or the ways that they've attacked these problems.
Any more questions?
Well, if not, I'll leave you with the final slide. This sort of talks about what I was talking about just earlier, that the highest early dropout was in the programs with high credits per course ratio. If we compare the three programs. And so this, I think that we need to reconsider the impact of course lengths and credit distribution of courses, which brings us back to a curriculum design. And we all know how hard the curriculum design in higher education really is, to work with multiple professors to try to put together a program that where there's huge interdependencies. And then if we split this up into smaller module, it becomes even more daunting a task. Perhaps to favor incremental accumulation of credits rather than heavy lengthy courses for programs aimed at non-traditional students, so they can feel that they're succeeding in small steps and earning and working their way towards this degree, or even that they have achieved certain skill sets and they can come away from it. Perhaps we need to redefine as well what success is and how we allow them to enter these courses. Whether we really go for degree completion or not, is that the only indicator of success? Yes, yes. There's enrollment numbers, but then there's, I think the enrollment numbers are really good, but what happens, we need those enrollment numbers, but those will drop off if no one's ever finishing, if no one's ever completing or not finding what they want. I think there's enrollment numbers, but they're somewhere we should take into account perhaps the number of courses within a program completed as well, and not just whether the program itself is completed. And maybe that's one of the ways to convince program management. I don't know. On the other hand, then you see this being taken to an extreme, that students enroll per course and pay per course, and sort of becomes a program a la carte, or which has other implications.